Start the dialectics lecture already? Alright, fine. Let me preface this by saying, wow, we're going to hit 80 views today. That's fucking crazy. All-time high. Okay, sorry. I'm going to get right into this. Prefacing this, I did not have time to really prepare for this stream besides thinking about a few things about what I wanted to say. But the reason for that is that right now I'm in law school. So there's that. I don't have a lot of free time. The other thing, though, is that I don't want you guys to overthink this. I want this to be a chill stream. I don't want you guys, and most of the time when you're talking about education, people are going to be intimidated. People are going to be like, "What? This is the authority." It's not like that. I'm not going to speak from an authoritative place where I'm going to say, you have to believe. I'm not going to give you definitions and axioms and all the empirical statistics and all that fucking shit like Vosh. I'm just going to work with you, the chat, and I want you guys to bear with me, and I want you guys to be brutally honest about whether any of this makes sense to you, because that's my goal, is to make it make sense to you. The first thing I wanted to do was preface this by saying I want to put a disclaimer, because this is something I noticed with our last educational stream, and it's something I noticed with all of the attempts we make to introduce new concepts and new ideas to you guys, or at least present old concepts in new ways. I'm going to add a disclaimer. The following stream is going to present dialectics in a way that you will not be immediately familiar with. That means we are not going to virtue signal any of the phrases, talking points, or things you've heard about what dialectics is in the past. We're going to start from scratch based on simple common sense and hopefully relate what we arrive at to some of the things you're familiar with. We want to present something old in a brand new way, putting it in new words in order to clarify many confusions and dogmas that now prevail regarding the concept. This is our disclaimer. Basically, you're not going to be familiar with how... this is something I noticed. Many people are looking for us to tick boxes of talking points they've heard before, because they don't actually want to learn anything new. They want to test us and see if we're familiar with the things they're familiar with. Well, you're just going to have to take my word at the fact that I am fully familiar with all the shit that you're familiar with when it comes to dialectics. I just think they're very vague and confusing and leading to a lot of errors and opportunism. So I want to present it in a new way, from scratch, completely bypassing all of that. If you can do the work of thinking, you'll see how it's all related. You'll see how this is related to what Lenin said and what Marx said and what Engels directly said. But I'm not going to repeat to you phrases and sentences and, mantras and all sorts of textualistic talking points just to kind of confirm and scratch that itch you might have for me to just speak from this legitimate, official and orthodox perspective. And the Bible said it so. It's not where infrared is coming from whatsoever. So you're just going to have to get over that. I'm also going to make another disclaimer. What you take away from this stream is going to be entirely up to you. No matter what we say or how we say it, people are going to try and say it is completely meaningless bullshit that makes no sense whatsoever and is ultimately the equivalent to saying nothing at all. I can't control this. I can't do anything to stop people from making those claims. So it is ultimately up to you, the viewer, to decide whether a meaning is being communicated here or not. I am not going to try and convince you that I'm a human being trying to communicate something meaningful for a reason. You either accept this assumption or don't. Your choice. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Dude, shut up, Neat. That's literally the opposite of what we're gonna fucking do. Alright, so now we're gonna have the intro to dialectics. Believe it or not, I was going to make a 10-minute video, but I decided not to, and I was going to make this about this issue of language. Whenever I seem, for example, the tweet I made about I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to like rehash all this shit. But I basically said something about the difference between these empiricism kind of things and the dialectic approach. And I said most of the time, when people on the internet, for example, or on YouTube and all that shit, when they're asking for empirical evidence, the reason isn't because they're curious about sensory phenomena they're unfamiliar with, but they want some type of idle guarantee of truth. What is an idle guarantee of truth? What did I mean by that? Well, over on Lefty Poll, a very smart guy decided to just say that I was speaking nonsense. Why? Because the phrase idle guarantee of truth was a new combination of words he wasn't familiar with. And according to him, the only type of words or phrases you can say are virtue signaling talking points someone else already said. But I find this approach to what a concept is radically unfamiliar and radically alien and foreign. To me, I have an active understanding of language. The main thing, the main essence, is trying to convey a meaning. The meaning is what is essential. To me, the form in which the meaning is instantiated comes second. The meaning is primary. So using strings of words in ways you're unfamiliar with in order to convey the deeper meaning, to me, is more important than using strings of words in ways you're already familiar with in order to virtue signal about conveyances of meaning you're familiar with in the past. I was going to make it about language because it kind of had me start thinking, returning to some things I've thought about many years ago but haven't returned to, and which is the relationship the English language has to the conveyance of meaning is, I think, very unique and very bizarre compared to every other language that I've ever encountered in the world, especially as someone who is moderately an Arabic speaker, not completely 100% fluently, but I have the gist of the language. I was born and I grew up with it. To me, the English language, unlike other languages, does not rest upon, well, any type of vernacular English is going to be a different story. Black vernacular English is similar to the rest of the languages of the world. Southern United States vernacular English, similar to the rest of the world. But when it comes to East Coast or West Coast formal and official English, the one that's relevant for intellectual discourse and academic discourse and all that kind of stuff, English seems unique in its attempt to preemptively premise the meaning it attempts to convey in the very form of the word. And that seems self-evident. Doesn't every language do that? No. Every other language rests upon something called common sense, a common sense of some kind. Why is that? Because a word, what is the meaning of a word? What is the meaning of a word ultimately? The meaning of a word is ultimately not simply reducible to a string of other words. A meaning of a word is going to conjure associations that are based on your sense. And I'm going to clarify what I mean by sense later. But the meaning of a word conjures up a string of unconscious associations, unwritten and unspeakable associations that are ultimately rooted in your common sense, your sense. This sense is individual and particular and non-universal. Non-universal. What does that mean? It means, let's say I'm speaking Polish. There's a Polish guy here, right? And I'm in the Polish countryside. There's going to be the meaning of a word. The meaning of a word in Polish, for example, is not going to be reducible to any kind of universal definition. There's some meanings of words that only other Polish people are going to be able to understand. Why is that? Because despite that everyone individually is different, and everyone individually has different associations and meanings of words unconsciously based on their experiences and based on their backgrounds, the fact of the matter is that a nation or a community or a local tradition of some kind, for example, is based on a dialogue and a dialectic of establishing by unwritten and unconscious means common sense and common meaning. Common meaning. What this means, effectively, is that the site of meaning must take into account what is unwritten. Not just what is written, but what's unwritten. What's unwritten. It's like how they say, you're either in the know or you're not in the know, right? You either get it or you don't get it. When it comes to vernaculars, when it comes to languages, it's spoken in their everyday use, that's the case. You either get it or you don't. You get what it means or you don't. And I think officially and medically speaking, some people say that people who have autism have a really hard time understanding unwritten and unspoken meanings and unconscious meanings. Lacan had the very controversial view that autistic people don't have an unconscious for that reason. So I don't mean to offend people with the whole Anglo autism box shit, but you know, I'm not really that nice of a guy, and it is what it is, and sorry, I don't want to offend people, but that's what we're dealing with here, okay? So, what does this have to do with dialectics? Well, okay, one other thing. I just mentioned it's also based in sense. English is unique in the fact that it attempts to impose a universal common sense preemptively, whereas other language can convey meaning and must accept in good faith that other people will just get it. English tries to define the meaning preemptively and contain the meaning in the word against the void, not against the determinate addressee, such as the person in your community, such as your countrymen, such as the people in your nation or in your community or in your locale, or a definite other person, which requires a dialectic of mutual engagement and the construction of mutual meaning. English rather arrogantly says that the meaning is already preemptively defined and can be imposed universally, such that to say a certain string of words doesn't actually require a determinate addressee. The word itself self-contains the meaning, qua the void even. Qua even something like the void. It is meaningful even qua the void. How have the English come to justify this? In this sense, English is the first modern language. The reason is because, for them, they have reduced the deeper sense of words, the deeper, unspeakable sense of words, to the empirical sense, to the literal object reducible to the five senses: touch, smell, sight, hearing. This is all you have to go on in the English language. Empirical truth plus some kind of pre-written definition. These two things, for the English language, supposedly exhaust meaning. An analytic figure called Rudolf Carnap critiqued Heidegger precisely on these grounds. For him, empirical truth and discrete, predefined definitions encompass and define the whole of human meaning. The whole of human meaning can be reduced to this. But most people in the world who have English as a secondary language have as their primary sphere of communication a somewhat criminal language. They have a language which they know can never be made enunciable and directly apparent in the English language, and they know this. If you're a secondary English speaker, you know what I'm talking about. There's something subversive, there's something almost criminal and off the books about speaking in a non-English language within a formal English setting. Because English has become a global language. But the reason it's the global language is because English is also a technical paradigm. English is also a technical paradigm. What I mean by that is that English, as the first modern language, doesn't have as its primary object human conveyance of meaning and communication, but some type of relation to the inhuman, estranged, let's just say technical forces of production. That's why the English language is so fixed and predefined. It's pegged to a predefined, empirically airtight and absolutely scientifically certain meaning, because this scientific certainty is operative in modern technology, for example, or in formalistic modern anything, in modern form in general, legal, whatever. Poland is not based. Well, it depends on the context. Maybe within Poland, this isn't the case, because everyone just speaks Poland anyway. But I guarantee you, if you're an immigrant in the United States and you're living in a Polish community, you know, your native Polish language is going to feel criminal in a sense. With French, there's a lot of context words that change meaning. English really is more predefined with words. Exactly. Why am I talking about language? What does that have to do with dialectics? Well, etymologically, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Etymologically, dialectics has its roots in dialogue, discourse, debate, some type of back and forth conversation. This is what dialectics mean, though. I hope it sounds like that for you guys, right? Doesn't it sound like this? Dialectic. They say, for example, there's a local dialect, right? You know what that means? A dialect. And it's a language. It's a way in which things are spoken. A local dialect. Some kind of dialect. A variant of a language, of a formal language of some kind. Dialectics, etymologically, has its roots in dialectics, discourse, debate, some other type of back and forth conversation. Okay, well, let's start getting visual. And do we pick on poor sage? Do we pick on poor sage here? Here we have poor sage in ancient Greece or something, classical philosophy. And I'm being very generous with how I'm drawing him. Sage speaks, and another person responds. Here, a dialectic is initiated. Why? Why is something like a dialectic initiated by this encounter right here? Well, let's ignore this debater here. Here's the question. Who is the addressee of Sage's speech? This is a big mystery. Who is the addressee of Sage's speech? When you speak, you convey meaning with intention. You're trying to convey something meaningful ultimately to something. Otherwise, why speak? Isn't there always a reason why you're going to expend effort to speak, to say something? The question is, who is the addressee of some person's speech? This question mark is always going to result in an addressee of some kind who's going to give you knowledge, who's going to tell you something that you didn't know before you engaged in the speech. It doesn't matter who the addressee of Sage's speech is. What every addressee is going to have in common, otherwise there is no reason for any dialogue whatsoever, is ultimately this other, let's just call them the other, this other is always going to have in common the fact that the other is expected to return to you something that could not have premised the speech itself. If it's a determinate other, there is no reason to speak to them unless, and we're speaking about a very abstract philosophical dialogue, whatever, there's no reason to speak to someone unless you can have the assumption that they're going to tell you something that could not have premised your speech in relation to them in the first place. Otherwise, speech is not communicative. It is not a dialogue. Otherwise, it's not a dialogue, but a form of domination. If you are absolutely certain about the content of your speech, irrespective of to whom it may be addressed, your goal is not to receive something from the other, which could not have premised your speech. Your goal is some kind of domination. Not just giving orders. It can even be an SOS, come please help me. But you're ultimately exacting a result. You're trying to exact a result of some kind. Maybe I should not say domination, I should say order. It's an order. Premised your speech. What does that mean? Okay, GNU Linux. Chill the fuck out. Premised your speech means if it's a dialogue of some kind, then whatever it is the other is going to return to you could not be something that preemptively premised the reasoning and the rationale in your own head, and also the objective, material, causal reason as to why you said it. They're going to give you a result that is not only unexpected, but could not possibly have been premised in the original speech. You say a string of words, you convey a meaning, and they're going to tell you something that in a sense surprises you. That's what I mean. Just trying to begin somewhere simple, guys. This isn't easy stuff. You can't use the word in the definition. What are you talking about? Why? What do you mean you can't use the word in the what does that mean? Explain to me what that means. Ignore chat? No, I want to help this guy. He's coming, he's asking for help. What does he mean? The sage wants a fucking surprise. Then why engage in a dialogue of any kind? Why speak at all? Why speak at all? Is the question. Why speak at all? So a premise that is not part of your argument, doesn't go into your speech. It's not going into the input that leads to the output of your speech. Basically, what I'm trying to get at, Does premise to your speech mean it was not a premise in your original argument? No, you're overthinking it. I'm not saying a logical premise in your original argument. I mean, it objectively did not premise the reasoning, the cause, the rationale behind your speech. It did not objectively premise your speech. It was not part of the input that gave rise to your speech in the first place. A premise is a part of an argument, premise, conclusion. So much mean premise. I didn't mention a fucking argument though, but even then I disagree. But even then I didn't say anything about an argument, okay? I didn't say anything about an argument. Sorry, I'm sorry for getting mad. I'm catching up with the chat. Okay, sorry. Let's delete all this and go back. So what am I trying to get at here? I'm trying to establish in the form of a dialogue, let's say a Socratic dialogue, where you guys know what a Socratic, not a Socratic, that's an example of one, but the Platonic dialogues. Plato was one author. The way in which he develops his philosophy, Plato, is that he has one guy here, paste that, he has one guy, flip horizontal, he has one guy, Plato is right here, he's the author, one author, he's using both of these as his puppets, right, for his dialogue. Why is he doing this? Because Plato is developing his philosophy, his dialectic, by having one guy say something, right? One guy's going to say some shit, and then another guy's going to say, probably, he's going to respond, or he's going to say the exact opposite thing. Through this, Plato recognizes there is some kind of outcome, constructive outcome. Why is that? Why can't it just be a monologue of one guy talking? Why is there necessarily an other? Why is it necessary that for Plato, for example, it could be anyone, there is necessarily an other who must say the opposite thing or respond? Because I'm adding too much lines. Because if it was just a monologue, the reason it's not a monologue, only a monologue, and he needs another person to say the opposite thing to get it going, is because for him, another person, let's say this guy, is giving embodiment, giving expression, embodying the necessary ground of otherness upon which the truth or essence of the original claim can be clarified. When I say something, or the person giving a monologue says something, you don't necessarily know what it is you are saying. Remember what I said about Anglo language. With Anglo language, you are already certain as to the meaning of what you're saying. Here, your speech is addressed to some kind of absence, some kind of emptiness. You speak something into existence because you find it necessary to express something, but you don't know what that something actually is. Another person who's initiating a dialogue or a dialectic, for example, will give expression and embody the ground of otherness upon which what you are trying to say can actually be revealed. And why is this? Because the ground that gives rise to the necessity and even possibility of speech cannot possibly be contained in the speech itself. This ground right here, this is the ground of otherness I'm talking about. This is the ground of otherness I am referring to. It is necessarily outside of you somehow. It is other than you. Try to explain the inadequacies of Anglo language and the Anglo language. No, you do that perfectly fine. It's just people are confused about what you mean when you use the English language. This is the ground of otherness that I'm referring to. The very ground that give rise to the necessity and even possibility of speech. Plato, for example, gives expression to this otherness in the form of another person. What have I just established right now? I've established, this is not the best way to approach it. Keep in mind, I didn't have time to prepare for this. I'm in law school. Bear with me. I'm trying to work with you guys. I started this out with Sage or someone speaking. What have I done here, though? I've created a contrast of some kind. You have a person with an output, for example. Output. And then you have an other. Some type of otherness that reveals the truth of the input. Because he cannot contain the input that premises his speech in the output, at least so far as he knows. This is he. See this? He cannot contain the input that premises his speech in the output as far as he knows. This other is going to reveal to him something that could not, as far as he knows, premise his output. That's why he speaks an output in order to discern what he himself is trying to say. It's like a university lecture. I know this is so hard. This is so hard. Let's just roll this back. I know this is not a good start. I know I'm not doing a really good job here. But let's just roll this back a little bit. Let's just roll this back a bit. And I want to start with something maybe you're more familiar with. Let's roll this back. Okay, let's roll this back. Sorry, I'm not doing a best job. Let's roll this back to metaphysical dualism. Now, this is something you guys are probably familiar with, right? In metaphysical dualism, across the history of humanity, you've got what? You've got this yin-yang thing, and then you've got something you probably haven't heard of, Manichaeanism. You got Gnosticism. You've got all sorts of dualisms. Can you get a fucking PowerPoint? Make this beforehand? Daniel, the problem is I can't. Like, I just got out of class before I did the stream. And I wrote a paper yesterday and Tuesday. So I'm bogged down with law school right now. Until I can escape law school, I'm going to try to work on the imperialism one maybe a week ahead of time. And slowly add to it and work to the PowerPoint. Okay. There's metaphysical dualism. You're probably familiar with this, right? There's yin and yang, Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and there's all sorts of dualities you're going to find across history and various mythologies and all that kind of bullshit. You're going to find that the world is being represented in opposites, right? Being, the world, the universe, whatever, is represented in the form of opposites. I hope you guys are familiar with it. The way most people interpret this is two metaphysically positive entities that contradict one and another. For example, here. Oh, fuck. Alexander just reminded me. This is the most important anchor point for all of this. This one right here. All the gods. This is the most important one. Sexual difference. Man, woman, masculine, feminine. This is the primary means by which metaphysical dualism is given expression in relation to. Some kind of sexual difference. I want to begin here. Right here. Most people, I want to ask you to chat the question. Why is two so privileged across the history of human civilization and in general? Why is there metaphysical dualism? Now, in today's universities, you have an attack against binary logic, favoring pure multiplicity and pure diversity instead. Because for them, the binary is just one. The binary for them is just 1 plus 1. So they asked a simple question: why must there be 1 plus 1? When we can have 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Why 1? Why not 2? Why 2? Why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Why not 6, for example? This is the basic, and then you're going to see this kind of logic expressed in other places, even in physics. What do you have? You have many worlds theory, and then in analytical philosophy, you have another type of many worlds. There's many possible languages and many possible worlds and many possible whatever. You know, it's like it's this privileging of multiplicity, right? Privileging of multiplicity over binaries. No, forget Badiou. I don't mean it like Badiou. Okay? Or Deleuze. I don't mean it like them. Just in a commonsensical way. You know, I want to have the least barrier to entry to this. Everyone is probably familiar with this. All of you are probably familiar with this. Can I get a 1 in the chat if you're familiar with metaphysical dualism? You've heard of the yin-yang. You know about the way in which opposites are used to give expression as the most primordial state of being. You know, there's two opposites that define being. And then the whole man, women, binary logic. 1 in the chat if you guys understand this. Now, I want to focus your attention now on this little box, and we're going to save this box while we delete everything else. The way most people interpret metaphysical dualism is two positive entities that contradict each other. You've got 1 plus 1. Well, that is arbitrary, isn't it? Why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Why 2? Well, I'll tell you what. This is a big misunderstanding of both the origin of why metaphysical dualism is so prevalent and what the unity of opposites relevant to dialectics is. This is a big misunderstanding. Yeah, the mind-body difference, Daniel. That's a really big one. Mind-body dualism is one you guys are probably familiar with as well. And that's also sexed and gendered, right? Body is female and mind is masculine. You got the logos and you have Sophia. You have all sorts of different... That's Gnosticism and all that kind of stuff. The mind-body one is, I think it's very prevalent across the history of humanity, but it's given fullest expression, I think, through Gnosticism, and then Gnosticism culminating in Descartes, and that's what's critiqued as binary logic in the universities. But this is what I want to focus your attention on. It is not that metaphysical dualism is arising out of an arbitrary imposition of just privileging two ones. Because in that case, why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Why not 6? Yeah, base versus superstructure is another one. Which is also why, in most ways people use base versus superstructure, it's undialectical. I'll explain that more later. But let's get rid of this. Here's what we need to keep in mind when it comes to dialectics. Dialectics, it always begins with one. Dialectics is actually monotheistic. It's so controversial on this shit I'm going to say. Sorry. Always begins with one. Maybe I should de-emphasize this a little bit so as to not confuse you guys. But I'll clarify what I mean by it. But I want to emphasize that. Dialectics, it always begins with one. There is always a striving and an orientation to what is ultimately one thing. One thing. Two is merely the most initial, primordial, and immediate expression given to a difference experienced proper to oneness. You've got one thing first. You understand? You've got one thing first. Two merely is the most initial expression given to the fact that, and here's where I'm going to say, the form, instantiation, and box, if you will, we give to oneness will always necessarily enter into contradiction with its actual and real content. Metaphysical dualism is never actually an arbitrary unity of two ones. It's always trying to give expression to this primordial distinction, if you will, Guys, this is another issue we're going to have with these education streams, is that you're looking for who I'm referencing, and you're looking for which authority this is citing. But I am just trying to get you guys to think about this independently. Don't worry about how I'm arriving at this. Don't worry about who's the background. I'm not talking about Mao. I'm not talking about Badiou right now. I'm not talking about Zizek right now. Okay? Let's think actively instead. Let's just think actively. Right? Let's try to think of it independently. So it is like multiple conflicting deities being merged into one super... I don't know how you're drawing that. I just said you begin with one. Now, the multiple is a different story right now, but you begin with one. When you're concerned with dialectics and the abstract, it's always because the only reason there's a unity of opposites, the only reason you privilege opposites is because you're dealing with one and its otherness. One and its otherness. Its own otherness. This otherness is that one. Do you understand? This otherness, proper to the one, is the one estranged from itself, somehow. The form and the content. Is this like the essence of something and the appearance? Sure, that's another way of putting it. The essence and the appearance. One and its otherness. Yes, that's how you should put it. One and its otherness. One and its otherness. Now, why do we begin with one? Why does one begin with one? I just said it. I just said why. Because, why begin with one? Because one begins with one. One person begins, one thinker, subject, individual, mind begins with one. So once you put something into a box, it's no longer reality. It's the science of biology. It's no longer what's really happening. It's the model. No, don't worry about that, okay? I'll get to what the box is. Another way of putting that is the opposite discloses something about the one. Yes. Yes. Pin that comment. Yes. Very true. Very much what I'm trying to get at. Begins with one. We are instantiated in a determinate, singular way. Our object is always one. Fuck this text box, man! God fucking damn paint! Insofar as our speech, our thoughts, our mind, etc., is determinate and itself singular. Our object is always one insofar as our speech, our thoughts, our mind is determinate and itself singular. In a sense, ontology is monotheistic itself. When we ask what is being, we're asking what is something. What is a something? That something is ultimately implied as one something, one being, right? Being itself confronts us as one thing. And even when we divide it into several things, that's only insofar as those several things bear witness to the fact that there cannot just be one thing. There's multiple because there cannot just be one, for example. I wanted to clarify this about metaphysical dualism. The difference between masculine and feminine, in contrast to what they teach you in the American universities, for example, there's no transphobia on my part. I'm not like Paul Cockshot or whatever. But I'm going to just say this, because anyone who's saying otherwise is lying. This difference between metaphysical dualism between masculine and feminine is the very expression, for example, of a dialectic between form and content, between night and day, for example, darkness and light, body and mind. These distinctions are proper to every human civilization. Now, all human other civilizations do have a sense of multiplicity and so on, but this multiplicity is ultimately coming from branching out from this original difference. Man versus woman isn't dialectical. Okay, but you know what I mean, gentle Ginjit. You know what I mean? I mean masculine and feminine. Metaphysical dualism is trying to give expression to one thing, ultimately one thing, which is being. It is not an arbitrary privileging of two for no reason. It is trying to give expression to one thing, being itself. Who is our original one? We began with one person speaking to one addressee. But there's other ways to situate the contrast between the basic contrast that initiates a dialectic. Okay, let me go back a little bit and just say we should now be able to understand very simply that a dialectic is some kind of interaction, some kind of encounter between two opposites, a one and its other. The object of dialectic unifies them both as ultimately one being. What are other examples of this encounter between some type of one and its an otherness? For example, we have a person and their addressee in this case, maybe this is a crazy person, their addressee in this case isn't another person, but is nature. Nature, for example, means what? It means same thing. This is another example. This is another example of an otherness. Another example of otherness. Nature. Now, here's something else I want to say. I know this is kind of schizo, this is all over the place. In a way, In a way, dialectic view has been the default for the entire history of humanity. For the entire history of humanity, there's always a sense of the unspeakable, sublime, etc. otherness that conditions the possibility of meaning, speech, reason, etc. But only after Anglo-Saxon modernity and Saxon metaphysics does the dialectic of being become foreclosed. Only here is there a striving to arrive at the object as reducible and premised by one universal, self-subsistent, and absolutely self-certain form. Why is that? Why is this? Not just like what is the reasoning behind me saying this, but why did it actually happen in reality? No, I don't get why the opposite doesn't do the same thing for the one non-opposite. Because within the standpoint of a single person, a single subject, a single speaker, a single thinker, what you are, what your being is, for example, is not known to you, is only revealed to you by means of the other. The other is the site at which what you are can be revealed to you. Why do you guys think people go on the internet and seek attention? Because we don't know what we are, fundamentally. We search for other people to reveal what we ourselves are. That's why we go on the internet and we type on lefty pole, for example, even though we're anonymous. Because we want to type something and we want to see how people are going to respond to us. And that's going to reveal to us what we are. Because we don't know what we are. Should I be thinking in terms of electric charge? No, don't worry about that. That's way too metaphysical. Don't worry about that kind of stuff. But I am already revealed to myself. That is my ego. But what is your ego, for example? What is the content of your ego? And in terms of Lacanian thinking, you just equated Anglo with the process of foreclosure, which is to say psychosis. Gentle Ginjit, I'm doing it intentionally. According to Lacan, normal experience of normal reality, which I interpret as experience of modern normal life, does result from foreclosure, is a primordial form of psychosis. Yes, I know that. I say that intentionally. There's also Heidegger's foreclosure of being, I think, which is what I'm aiming at a little bit more. The foreclosure of being itself, of the question of being. Being itself becomes foreclosed, and we only can speak now of particular beings. Being as such becomes foreclosed to us as something that reveals itself in a novel and unique way. Is this a more refined version of Taoism? Well, I would argue that the world's religions in general have this as their object, not the other way around. It's not that I'm trying to reproduce world religions in the past. I think these world religions have this contradiction defining being itself as their object, including Taoism, which is more explicit about that, but also every other religion, including ones that are not necessarily dualistic metaphysically. You should explain what foreclosed means. Foreclosed in the sense of sealing off, closing off, right? Sealing off, closing off. To proceed now, we can recognize a simple difference, proper to oneness. Something and its other. Form and content. Form something is and its actual content. But how does it come to pass that the object of dialectic is itself revealed as one thing, one sight, one disclosure of being? Okay, this is the topic question that I want us to focus our attention on. Let's focus our attention on this. We can recognize a simple difference proper to oneness, something and its other, the form of what something is and its actual content. But how does it come to pass that the object of dialectic is itself revealed as one thing, one disclosure of being? Well, why don't we relate this to this issue of socialism? Why are most people socialists? What does socialism mean, for example, for most people? It means, here I am, for example. This is a contradiction, isn't it? I'm here, I'm sad. And shitty world. Right? Isn't that the case? It's a shitty, bad world. Everything sucks. And here I am, and I'm sad about this. Okay. Isn't this a contradiction? Isn't this what we're talking about? When we're talking about BreadTube, and we're talking about the entire aesthetic of socialists in 2021. Doesn't this ultimately imply a type of arrogance? Isn't this also kind of arrogant? Hegel, a guy you're probably a little familiar with, the name, he referred to this aesthetic as the aesthetic of a romantic. The romantic, let's say the romantic is an aesthetic of the unhappy consciousness. The unhappy consciousness, according to Hegel, is an initial encounter with the fact that, gotta move this here, initial encounter with the fact that the inner self radically enters into contradiction with the outer world, being unable to find full expression in it. This is the most important thing. So what does the socialists do and say? Socialists say this is a shitty world. And how do they arrive at the conclusion that's a shitty world? Because the world does not reflect what is within them. The world does not reflect the striving, their inner striving to be realized in the world. Instead, they're confronted with a contradiction, and they're confronted with imperfection or whatever, right? Yes, gentle Genjit, exactly, it's the beautiful soul we're talking about here, okay? The socialist says the solution to this is to change the world. Solution to this, the world must be itself be changed. So what is going to happen now? Am I going to be Jordan Peterson and say, no, you have to change? Clean your own bedroom before you want to change the world, bucko. Maybe you just got to change your outlook. But although I'm not going to get into Jordan Peterson time, Hegel arrives at something that superficially might sound a little similar to this Jordan Peterson thing. For Hegel, the problem with this socialist right here, who bases their entire aesthetic and their identity upon the fact, upon this initial encounter with a contradiction, from here on out, every line you see like a dash like this is a contradiction. Hegel says what this person cannot see is how this contradiction, this is the difference itself, the contradiction for Hegel, is actually proper to the very object, the world itself. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means this. The Anglo-socialists you are familiar with on BreadTube and on YouTube, they are this guy. They think this is a shitty world, and the goal is to change the world in that sense. Not in Marx's sense, but in their sense, right? Special sense. They're elevated above the world. They know better in their head the truth, whole truth of being, simply because they have encountered a contradiction. But the contradiction is still purely subjective. But this is still a purely subjective contradiction. The only source of the contradiction here is the fact that the world does not conform to what the socialist feels is within their very soul. But what Hegel says, According to Hegel, what Hegel says is that to recognize the contradiction as itself objective means that you recognize the difference, the contradiction, as proper to the thing itself, not just something that dwells inside of your heart, but is actually proper to the object itself. The object, the wound, is already reconciled. This is what Hegel means by the wound on the cross. We only see the world as shitty, but we do not include in the world the very contradiction that we experience in a purely subjective way. If we did include the contradiction that we experience purely subjectively as a feature of the object itself, paradoxically, this is the source of an immense reconciliation. Why is that? Because for Hegel, for example, deliverance to the true object is the source of true subjective freedom and, let's say, absolute knowledge. When we recognize the contradiction as proper to the object itself, and not just something that is instantiated subjectively as the difference between ourselves and the world, we put the contradiction to work. We see the contradiction as the object itself, and we see it as something which is the source of a continued development of some kind. The contradiction sets in motion the beginning of work. The beginning of work. The beginning of work. Why? I gotta clean this mess now and explain why. And I'm gonna save this little arrangement and get rid of it too, so I can bring it back. Why is there reconciliation? Because this whole thing becomes proper to the world, the object. Contradiction, what is the implication of this? The implication is simple. The object, the world, society, is no longer taken or expected to be a whole form, the deviation from which was the prior source of disappointment and unhappiness. Contradiction is rather recognized as a feature of the object itself, thus placing the subject on a new footing that is delivered to a relation to the world defined by its own active development, the dialectic of freedom and necessity. This is kind of all about aesthetics, this turn. We went from language to aesthetics. This is such a long paragraph too. So anything that you pursue is your other, even if it is something in an ideal self of some kind. Not necessarily. The other is going to be the objective response you're going to get in that pursuit. You're going to pursue, for example, an ideal self, and reality is going to spit out something completely different than what you expected to be your ideal self. That is the expression of the otherness. It is only when there's a response to you that it's an otherness. If I accept I will always be lacking in anything, then why pursue anything? Well, what is the object of that you can pursue? If you recognize it's not that you will always be lacking, Daniel. It's that the object itself is lacking. The object itself, why is it lacking? It's only lacking from a subjective perspective. In actual reality, the object is positive in such a way that you subjectively experience it as lacking. But this subjective experience results from a feature, an objective material feature, proper to the object itself. I feel like this would make much more sense if it was another language than English. I don't expect you guys to get this right off the bat. This is just an intro. And it's not the best intro possible. But I want you guys to take something away from it at least. Something away. Now you guys can see, on a deeper German idealist perspective, why I say we're living in socialism. Partially the reason why I say we're living in socialism is because I want to combat what Ginjit rightly recognized as what Hegel called the beautiful soul. I want to combat this aesthetic of socialism. This way, the meaning of we already live in socialism is that socialism is no longer confined to a little box in our heads forever set against the world. The very contradiction that gives rise to our socialistic subjectivity is recognized to be proper to the object, the world itself. Hence, the world is already socialist. That's what I'm arriving at. This initiates, right here, putting it onto the object itself, reinitiates the dialectic process. What's called in Marxist terms, unleashing the forces of production. You become subjectively attuned to the dialectic of freedom and necessity, and you become delivered to this process of the unleashing of the forces of production. I have a long journey to go. Don't worry about it. A lot of people take years and years to understand this stuff, and I'm trying to condense a lot, Okay, now, dialectics. I want to try and work with your guys' associations when you see this word dialectics. Above all, what you should be thinking about is the tit for tat, the back and forth, the movement of something to its opposite, nothing, and back, all inscribed, all proper to one object, ultimately one object itself. A dialectic refers to a movement that every form, every discrete form and tangible form necessarily enters into contradiction with its own conditions of existence in a way that cannot be preemptively defined, known, or contained within the form itself. But when I hear the word dialectics, the first thing that comes to my mind is different understandings of dialectics. Western versus Eastern Marxists had, which itself is dialectic. Absolutely, absolutely. Guys, all of this comes together. Okay? The East versus West difference is a dialectic. The rural versus urban is a dialectic. Town versus country is a dialectic. Mind versus body is a dialectic. Marxist materialist dialectic means there's a unity of opposites. So it is a search for grounding these contradictions in such a way so as to arrive at their objectivity. The contradiction is itself a material object. The contradiction is itself what is material. That's why I speak of substantialism as Anglo-Saxon 17th century metaphysics. Within substantialism, the thing that is material is already a predefined form of some kind. It's a tangible object in the colloquial sense of our word. It's an object like this water bottle. It's an object like an apple. It's already a predefined form. But object relevant for dialectics, materialist dialectics, for example, what is so material about the object is not the fact that it is sensuously real, only sensuously real, but that the contradiction reveals itself as objective in a way that cannot be contained, for example, in a previous grounding of the dialectic. The example of this is Hegel's dialectic. Hegel's dialectic attempted to ground the very subjective appreciation of dialectic itself in ultimately one form, philosophy, through philosophy. Marx simply continued the dialectic. He said, Hegel, can't you see that in this movement of arriving at absolute knowledge, having exhausted the whole extent of philosophy and the movement of philosophy, you have merely arrived and commanded, if you will, compelled an encounter with the otherness in actual reality that is the proletariat. The proletariat is the concrete disclosure of a unity of opposites. Namely, and this is kind of separate from dialectics, the proletariat, the proletariat, a concrete manifestation of a contradiction. And what is this contradiction? What is this contradiction? The actual living expression of what Hegel arrives at in thought. as the unity of opposite. Philosophers only interpret the world, the point is to change it. Neat trolling as usual. The actual living expression of what Hegel arrives at in thought, primarily a scandal for philosophy, since it debases philosophy's universal state. Man as premised by thought, form, as citizen. Proletariat is a hole in the edifice of Hegelian universal statehood. Modern statehood in general. Proletariat, the one. Productive relations, the other. No, the proletariat, Daniel, this is where we must escape the one-sidedness of merely recognizing the dialectic in the form of a contradiction and recognize the contradiction itself to be objective, which means our object is no longer one or the other. Our object is the very essential contradiction for which the distinction between one and other is a secondary expression, subjectively of. Meaning, the proletariat is itself a concrete unity of opposites. The unity of opposites between what? From the perspective of the universal state which attempts to premise man by some kind of form, the citizen. The proletariat is the living contradiction, the unity of opposites between man and his material, actual, sensuous, Marx, and living reality, the modern form of citizen. This is the unity of opposites that defines the proletariat. This is the unity of opposites defining the proletariat. Right? The other is the citizen, and what is the otherness of the citizen? For Hegel, the otherness of the citizen, for example, is the void. Form for Hegel arises forth from the void. For Marx, form does not arise from the void. Form arises from some type of material content, which cannot be preemptively known in thought or subjectively, but which is nonetheless real and material and objective. And in a sense, the bourgeois state, for example, the form of the bourgeois state arises in contradiction to what? The peasantry, right? The rural countryside, the vendee, whatever. The proletariat is the living and concrete manifestation of that contradiction as it's living and persisting. That's why Marx privileges the proletariat and not the peasantry. Marx privileges the proletariat because, for Marx, the dualism of the modern bourgeoisie and the cities and the mass, what Marx calls the mass of the rural poor, for example, this contradiction does not reveal anything to us about what is objective in being itself. It's a one-sided contradiction, right? It's not enough. We need the proletariat to disclose the fact that the contradiction is itself something that is objective and is not just dwelling in a subject who recognizes the difference between town and country, for example, or the mass of the rural poor. I don't know. This is the intro. This isn't going to be the last educational stream about dialectics. Maybe I'll say this. It's just my best attempt at an intro.